Welcome to the Laws of Style, featuring conversations on creativity, fashion, and the law from the leading edge of our economy and culture. Hosted by noted fashion lawyer Douglas Hand.
Hello and welcome to the Laws of Style. I'm your host, Douglas Hand, fashion lawyer, fashion law professor. And for this episode, I'm joined by a fellow practitioner, entertainment lawyer Adam Weissman. Adam, thanks for joining today.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, well, so tell us about your practice and working with creative professionals.
Yeah, so I have a little law firm that I started about 8 years ago now called Weissman Law, named after yours truly, which works firmly in the creative space. We're transactional only. We don't do any litigation, although we do handle dispute resolution. But our client base is fairly broad. We work with commercial producers, photographers, a lot of content creators and streamers and YouTubers in the, what we'd consider the influencer space, independent film producers, designers, both in the fashion space and more in the branded and art space, and then authors and managers, models, really anyone who has sort of a tie back to IP, usually some sort of commercial production aspect to it or commercial aspect to it, and things that ultimately fall back into the art space.
Got it. Got it. Well, so you started at a mid-sized firm, then you went in-house, and then you started your own firm. So really almost like the complete arc of what a legal practice can be. And so I think for a lot of our listeners, perhaps younger listeners trying to figure out what kind of a lawyer they are going to be, what were some of your either things that you loved about being at a mid-sized firm and in-house, or things that you loathed about those situations?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think really, you and I have chatted in the past and already any lawyer who's been doing it for more than 7 or 8 years, I find, has a story. There's no real straight path in law, despite law schools teaching us that you get your job and you're there for the rest of your life. Same with me. I came out of law school thinking that the only way to truly be a lawyer was to be a litigator. And the mid-sized firm that I went to was a mix of commercial litigation and criminal defense. So I had the privilege of getting to do a little bit of both that first year. I was actually going to court and doing some criminal defense work, but the stuff that really spoke to me in that space specifically was copyright litigation, commercial litigation, all things that sort of inform where I'm at today, but are very different from what I'm doing now. I left that firm at about the 4 year mark and truthfully was completely burnt out from it. I realized probably a couple years in that litigation wasn't necessarily it for me, but I wasn't really sure where I was going to go next. That's what ended up happening. The thing that you didn't know was that first job at a mid-sized firm was in Canada, up in Toronto, which is where I'm from and where I thought I'd be living my entire life. Through a series of circumstances, I ended up in New York. Shortly after leaving that job, I knew I didn't want to be a litigator anymore, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do yet. So I took the New York bar that summer of 2016, and I started interviewing mostly in like media and music related companies to do in-house jobs. And what ended up happening actually was I didn't get those jobs right away. But what I was doing for the first time in my career was really networking heavy, was getting out there, meeting people who would theoretically hire me, people who would theoretically be clients, people who would turn out to sort of just be mentors or helpful folks that I would still keep in touch with almost a decade later. But what ended up happening was I got called to the bar the very start of 2017, took on a few clients just by chance. This was just some folks in the music industry who were looking for an entertainment lawyer. And I knew enough that I could do their work. I, of course, was nervous because it was the first time I was doing work without having like a principal on top of me reviewing my stuff. But what ended up happening with this sort of in-house transition was mid 2017-ish, I met an influencer management company that at the time was kind of pioneering in the space. There were not a lot of companies managing influencers in 2017. In fact, the word influencer was just coming into like common parlance at the time. They didn't have a lawyer. And what ended up happening was very quickly my role went from reviewing a couple contracts a day to them realizing they needed me on an almost full-time basis.
Right.
They ended up introducing me to their sort of sister company owned by the same people, which was Nylon Magazine. which is a fashion and beauty magazine that's been around since the late 90s that also didn't have a lawyer. Those two things ended up taking up like 95% of my time. And I never technically went in-house. I was never technically a W-2 employee. In fact, I was still technically operating my practice the entire time as outside counsel, but it went from a couple contracts here or there to advising them on employment matters to helping them shape up their internal policy with respect to IP issues, really wearing that GC hat at a very early stage in my career, which was like absolutely fascinating. You can imagine I was only about 5 years out of law school when I was suddenly doing everything for these two companies. And
Were you pulling
the
in
one
other
piece,
firms for areas you weren't comfortable in?
well, I did a little bit. You know, I was really lucky that I met a bunch of very generous lawyers early on who were willing to sort of coach me through some of those issues. Anytime a serious litigation matter came up, we'd bring in outside counsel. I did bring in some outside counsel to help with some employment stuff as I was learning it. But I think the thing you find, especially when you run your own practice or you're operating in sort of a GC capacity, is you have to know a little bit of everything. Not enough that you would like just brazenly wake up and go to court to argue an employment case one day, but enough that you can advise on preliminary steps and then know when to bring in outside counsel. I think issue spotting is the biggest piece there. Um, but brought in a lot of folks when needed, handled most things myself as a GC does. And then over time, kind of just was bringing in other clients on the side. I stopped working with both of those clients just a couple of years ago when each of them were sold to outside parties. So it ended very well. But as I was sort of working with them, I had the opportunity to grow the rest of my client base. And since about 2022, have stopped working with them. And now it's just more so into even more traditional small law firm life where it's myself and an associate, and we're taking in new clients constantly and just working on a whole series of issues that really kind of in the best way possible relate back to everything I was doing when I was in that GC capacity at the magazine and at the influencer agency.
Yeah, it is, I think, a great training ground to be a generalist. A good GC has to be a generalist and can't have
Yes.
one slant or another, corporate or litigation or employment. It's got to, sort of balance all of those. Well, so interesting that, the word influencer was still in 2016, 2017, people didn't really know what it is. And I think now
Yeah.
it's maybe more firmly rooted, although there may be multiple definitions. Um, and I think clearly people would also consider that from a legal perspective to be a form of talent representation. And so, what are some of the challenges of working with talent? Because often when you hear that word, you think of maybe somebody who has a whole cadre of people around them telling them exactly what they want to hear and making them feel good. And as a lawyer, it's often difficult to be one of those people.
Yes. And that thought people have in their heads, it is warranted in some circumstances. And certainly I'm based here in New York. If you talk to some of our colleagues over in LA, like that's their life, the Hollywood lawyers who are literally just representing the capital T talent that we associate with film and television and who do have these giant teams around them and are surrounded by a lot of people who have to say yes a lot, which as a lawyer, the really good lawyers learn ways to say no without it sounding like a no, or at least give alternatives. But at the end of the day, we rain on a lot of folks' parades because we do have to put our feet down quite a bit. Now, working with talent in general, kind of what I'll say is like as a fundamental piece about why I really enjoy my job today is I really like working with people who create things and who are doing things, whether you consider it fine art or whether it's just a creative venture in the commercial space. I'll be agnostic about that for the purpose of this piece of the call, but I like working with people who love what they do and are passionate what they do, and they're creating something that other people enjoy. So that for me is always kind of the guiding principle when I work with any sort of talent. Now, on our practice at Weissman Law, we don't work with too many, I'll say traditional like actors or performers who are doing a single thing. We do from time to time. We certainly have models and actors and other folks that have crossed our desk and we've helped out in the past. But most of the talent that we're working with regularly are, I'll say, a little more dynamic. In the case of working in the content creator space or the influencer space, the talent that we're working with aren't just performing, they're also doing a lot of the creative behind the scenes. They're responsible for distribution, which is a major difference between them and every other sort of talent. That's sort of the interesting thing between creators and, let's say, an actor, is at the end of the day, the person who is putting that thing out in the world is a talent doing it from their social media platform, which comes with a whole slew of other issues we can talk about. But the sort of place that we're at today with the industry is most of the talent I work with, especially in the creator space, are actually the ones at the top of their team, sort of guiding down and bringing in contractors and other folks. Sometimes they do have managers and they do have agents and they are getting advice kind of on a lateral move. But really, what they're doing now is they're building up media companies that sort of resemble what I had back at Nylon, or a film company, even, where they have all these different creative contributors who are putting something up. So they're wearing a hat that looks a lot more like a traditional producer or media company owner, which for me is a little more fun and dynamic because it means the issues that pop up aren't just a single talent agreement that comes in every week. It's a dozen different types of issues that pop up and emergencies and IP considerations that we probably wouldn't be thinking about if we were just looking at, let's say, a performer agreement.
That's a really good point, and I think most people probably don't get that. That the gatekeepers of distribution for influencers are really gone. Unless
Yes.
you bump up against Instagram's rules, or or TikTok goes away, or is sold. But no, that's a really good point. I guess because so many of those folks may be either young, unsophisticated, and maybe just still emerging, how do you
Yeah.
deal with clients who can't afford your services, but you really want to work with them?
Yeah. Look, we've certainly given discounts to folks that are getting into situations where they really need help. But at the end of the day, and this goes across industry. This is not just in the influencer space too, but this is in any area of media, entertainment, or arts that we work with. The, you know, foundational largest percentage of talent or artists in any industry probably can't afford to retain a lawyer by the hour, and there's just no way of getting around that. And I am running a business, and it's not like I could take on everyone for free. So what we've done over time is we've created resources. We do webinars. I'm on Instagram and TikTok myself doing these short form videos, just teaching really basic principles. And I think the biggest piece that every sort of talent and artist needs to learn very early on in their career when they will not be affording a lawyer is twofold. A, make sure you understand how copyright works, and trademark too, but mostly copyright, to know how you are licensing things or giving away the work that you do. And B, talk to other folks in your industry to understand your worth and your value when you have contracts. And if you have those as your starting point, you're going to get 75, 80% of the way to where a lawyer is going to help you out anyway. So that's always been it for me. I know I can't help every single artist and every single talent myself just because I wouldn't have a viable business. But I do spend a lot of time kind of putting that out there. I recently joined a nonprofit that's just focused on fundraising and educating artists. And like, it's all these little things like that that I like to do that sort of act as the parallel to my day to day where I am having to charge by the hour for things that would just be not feasible for a lot of artists out there.
And it being a small firm, I guess you must also view that as a form of firm marketing, albeit not traditional big law marketing for sure, which really isn't marketing. It's buying tables at galas, or whatever it is big law does, to maintain Citibank as a client. But that is a non-traditional form of marketing. Is that correct? And are there any other channels that you would say you use as marketing that are non-traditional?
I think for almost every lawyer out there, unless you are a personal injury lawyer who's paying for those massive billboards that we all see all over the city, word of mouth makes up a huge portion of the business that comes in. The Instagram and TikTok stuff is helpful. We do sometimes get kind of like cold DMs through that, which is always funky. But I think the thing that does more than anything is it helps reaffirm to new clients that we know our stuff. I often do a lot of intake calls where I'll have a client go, "Oh, so and so sent me your way, but then I went on your Instagram and saw you do a video, and you were talking about the exact issue I need help with." And I go, "Yeah, that's like proof of concept right there." But beyond that, it's kind of the same as with any other lawyer. You do your networking stuff, you get out there. The marketing stuff is helpful. I would never recommend to a new lawyer starting a new practice that you start with like digital marketing or anything like that. It's more of a feather in your cap rather than a starting point to get a good foundation for clients. The only difference I'll say between, what I do versus maybe the average business lawyer, and this probably resonates with you as a fashion lawyer, is we're niche. We're pretty niche, and not every business needs our services. And conversely, we don't want to work with every business. So we do have to be kind of very selective with how we spend our time doing that networking in real life and kind of like hanging out with clients and going with them. But at the end of the day, it's all word of mouth is king for law firms, I think, regardless of what you do.
Well, so you are running a law firm, right? As am I, and we both know the administrative headaches that entails. How has it been? Are there cautionary tales that you might tell our listeners who might be considering that, or are there real opportunities? With a boutique type setting where
Sure.
the management responsibility is obviously not as much as a 500 lawyer firm.
Yeah, and look, I hired my first associate last year, so that's new. That's a new learning curve that I'm figuring out right now. I've had help in the past, but never full time, so it's a little different. Um, as far as starting to practice, I think I'm also the chair of the New York City Bar Small Law Firm Committee. And the only reason I'm saying that is because as a result of being in that position, I get lawyers reaching out to me on an almost weekly basis asking for tips on starting a practice and growing a business. And most importantly, building a foundation of clients. Because at the end of the day, we can't do our work if we don't have clients. And I think realizing that and realizing that the client management and client acquisition part of the business is not necessarily the most important piece, but it's the thing that keeps the lights on, and you can't have a business without it. And your head has to be there quite a bit, and that's the difficult piece because law school certainly never teaches us anything about that. And on top of that, most people, especially lawyers, are not comfortable sort of selling themselves, and that's actually the thing that I had to think about the most in the first few years of like, how do I get out there? How do I put myself out there? How do I present myself in a way that feels real and authentic to who I am, but also is, a little salesy? And building up that muscle was tough. I think it's gone to a point where it's pretty good now, but still to this day, I'm always asking where the next group of clients are going to come from. Now there's that piece. On the admin side and on the like administrative and on the side of just keeping things organized, we're really lucky in 2025 to have a ton of really good software that handles 95% of what a administrative assistant probably would have done a decade ago. I look back to when I was a first year lawyer and I had a full-time assistant as a like 25, 26-year old, which looking back at it was ridiculous. There was nothing that needed to be done except for because I was
He
a
or
litigator,
she knew a
sometimes help
lot
with
more
filing.
about what to do in that first 6 months than we did.
Oh, I had no knowledge base in that first 6 months. I mean, the difference between what you learn in law school and what you learn during practice is monumental. That's why it takes really a handful of years before a lawyer really knows what they're doing. But anyways, taking a step back to the firm question, it's just, learn trial by error a lot in those first couple of years. I think coming up with processes to just dictate how you run everything might not seem necessary when you have one or two clients at the start, but you realize that's the time when you do have to come up with all of those things and write everything down and come up with firm policies, even if your firm is a firm of one. Uh, and it just sort of makes things run more smoothly. And then when you do have new people and employees coming in, you have very clear instructions on how you want things to run. And most importantly, and you can probably speak to this more than I can, but when you start bringing in people, you want the service that they're providing to match how you handle things and to match how you do things with your clients. So that to me is actually the biggest piece because you don't have time to do that once they're already in place. So I think coming up with that beforehand and working on that beforehand is huge. And the biggest thing I see with solo practitioners, the issues I see there is I know solo practitioners have been doing it for decades longer than me. but it seems like they're always operating by the seat of their pants. And it's just like, yeah, maybe you should be a little more formalized with the stuff you do. I know we're not big law, and I know we don't have to be as buttoned up as that. And the emails we're sending out, and the way we're dealing with people is way more casual. But at the end of the day, you're still running a business. And don't forget that. And even though most of the business might be up here because we're lawyers and that's where our, worth is, you need to put it out there. You need to put structure out there. Otherwise, you're never gonna your clients are never going to see you as serious either. If you're using a Yahoo account and you're 25 years out in your practice, you're going to have a tough time getting those really good clients. So
Yeah.
it's kind of that mentality that you need to have in the back of your mind at all times.
Well, let's pivot and talk about the entertainment industry.
Please.
And I guess media, because traditional entertainment, would have been either music or film or TV. I mean, these days I don't even know what TV really means. It's sort of,
Yeah,
downloadable series. Certainly publishing has been an area that's been hit very, very hard, but has kind of moved online from
yeah,
from print. So tell me what you're seeing and how is AI impacting that? I mean, these are your clients. So, are they being impacted by AI and how are you advising? And current tariff situation. I know most of your
sure.
clients are providing services, but still there's, potentially an issue there. So just talk to us about the current state of entertainment.
Yeah. Well, if you saw that tariff announcement from a few days ago about the 100% tariffs on any film coming outside of from the US, which again, I don't know how that would actually be enforced or whether there's actually going to be anything done about that, but that scared a bunch of my clients. The entertainment industry in general is in a funny place right now. Traditional areas where traditional outlets like theaters, for example, or cable television are struggling. And even we're at the point now where streaming services are kind of in their second or third phase trying to figure out what to do. And I can tell you right now, like a lot of my clients who are able to easily sell their films to Netflix are having a very difficult time now because Netflix is kind of like hunkered down, and so is some of the other streaming services. It's a weird time. AI is not making things any easier. AI is taking away a lot of the like post-production jobs very, very quickly. AI has taken away jobs that have traditionally gone to creative agencies and photographers because brands are just like, hey, maybe we'll just do this next campaign with AI only. I think we're at an interesting time where we don't really know how AI is actually going to play out in the industries I work in long term. Right now, there's a big, much ado about it. Every tech company is trying to launch a million products. You as a lawyer probably get all these emails about all these AI platforms for lawyers, which I'm really hesitant to adopt them. I think in a couple of years, we'll see where this all sort of nets out. But it's hurting a lot of stuff right now. It's making people really apprehensive about moving forward in their creative careers. And it has taken away jobs from copywriters that I know. It has taken away jobs from editors that I know. That's been a tough one. And the other piece, going back to sort of tariffs and just the economy in general, there is an undercurrent of we don't know what the economy is going to look like later this year. Now, so far, things have been quite steady and good from what I've seen with my clients. But a lot of my clients make a living off of brand provided contracts, whether it's, audio video commercial production or influencer campaigns with brands or doing design. And that's what's feeding them while they're doing their artistic projects and their self-funded projects on the side. There's a sentiment that that might go away at some point because at the end of the day, if consumers aren't able to afford products, the brands are not going to hire my clients. And then my clients aren't going to be able to self-fund these other projects that we're working on together. So I don't know is the big answer right now. Things have seemed okay over the last handful of months, but I'm always hesitant to say that. On top of the sort of usual ebbs and flows in the industry is summer's always incredibly quiet for all industries I work in. So I'm looking at that. I'm like, June's coming up in another 4 weeks or so. So we'll see what happens there, anyways. But things are looking a little funny. I will say, on a positive note, something that I've been seeing a lot of lately in the entertainment industry is brands teaming up directly with YouTube creators and sort of small scale producers going, Here's some money. Go make that project you really wanted. This is not a traditional advertising venture. Go make a feature film. Here's $1.5 million. Do something with it. Release it. And when it's out there, just make sure we get a credit somewhere. You don't even have to feature our product or maybe promote us on the side outside of the film. That's really fascinating. I've had more of those conversations and seen more of those contracts in the last 4 months than I have my entire career. And I think that's sort of a way things are moving. Big budgets for films are only going to giant comic book temples and sequels and things like that and adaptations. New projects are not getting a ton of big budget from the traditional funding sources. So seeing new funding sources sort of come out of the woodwork, whether it's brands or new kinds of private investors, it's exciting. And it's also giving some of my clients more artistic freedom than they've had on these other projects in the past.
Right, right. Well, germane to my practice, maybe where are you seeing entertainment and fashion intersect?
Yeah. I'll tell you, with the content creators and influencers I work with, that's always been top of mind. Back when I started, it would be advertising clothes for fashion brands. Those were most of the deals I saw in my first couple of years. That and home goods, really. So there's that. I do represent a handful of small fashion brands, which has always been funky. And outside of that, I work with a lot of designers who are brought in to design for brands, and work with also some artists who get to do very cool collabs with some huge brands. I have some photographers I work with that have designed sneakers with some of the major players in the industry. So there's always been an undercurrent of fashion. I think the two are intertwined. Look at the Met Gala the other day, right? That is the intersection of fashion and entertainment. There's no way around it. And I would
sports. I mean, really, culture.
Yeah,
And passion.
yeah. I think fashion is an expression of art, so it's almost rote to say that they are the same thing. And while I don't consider myself a fashion lawyer, it comes up on a daily basis in my client work.
Well, many view entertainment like they do fashion as a glamorous industry. Um, in your practice, has that proven true? I mean, what are some of the more surreal moments where you were standing next to someone who was a client or wasn't, but still was, a household name that were, wow. And what moments have you had where you're just like, this is worse than being in the trenches on a, big pharma deal?
I've since leaving litigation, I'm maybe I just have perspective now where it's pretty rare that I get incredibly frustrated by my job, even when we're working on a deal and people are getting angry on the other side. We're just trying to clean it up. I can take a step back and I go, we're all working for the same goal, towards the same goals here. It's pretty rare that you have a true adversary on the other side of a deal. But outside of that, this what you're seeing here, this is my home office. This is most of my day to day. It is not a glamorous job for the most part. We're on our computers. Meetings don't even happen in person anymore. So really, most of my life is Zoom calls and Word documents. But that's not to say that we don't get to have a little fun and meet up with clients and other folks. I will tell you, I was at Sundance earlier this year, and a talent that I work with quite a bit. I'm actually representing his manager, but the talent that I happen to work with quite a bit, who had never met me in person. It was my first day at Sundance, and I just see him walking on the street with his small group of friends, and I just scream his name out, and he looks at me and he has no clue who I am. And I go, hey, I don't think you should know what I look like, but I just want to tell you, I'm your manager's lawyer. And he's just like, Adam? And he just gives me this huge hug. And it's this guy who I've been, watching for years. And it was great. And it's like little moments like that that are actually the most exciting, when you just get to see how, people you've been working with are real human beings. The other thing that's always very cool is you work on a project for months and months, and you're just working on contracts or counseling on IP issues, and then it's live, and then suddenly the film's out there in theaters, or it's a small scale production, it's out there on social media, or in some cases, which I'm sure you see even more than I do, you see the clothing item in stores, and you're like, oh yeah, I worked on that shoe contract. That's pretty funky. That's cool. But the thing that really makes it worthwhile is when you just get the opportunity to go see the thing in the real world and then kind of debrief with your clients about it after. I'm maybe a lowercase artist myself. I've been playing music my whole life and do a little bit of film work on the side. So I really like just sitting with the clients who do the work and kind of getting into their brains and not just having to wear the lawyer hat, but also getting to like talk a little bit more fundamentally about the work they do when we're done the legal piece. That to me is what truly makes it worthwhile. Is that, going back to your question, the most glamorous thing in the world? No, but I think for me, that's the most exciting part. I really enjoy making connections with people who are doing stuff and kind of getting into their head and appreciating what they do.
Yeah, it's tremendously fulfilling. And I think you'd agree. A lot of the advice isn't always pure law. It's, a lot of general business advice, sometimes a lot of psychiatry, a lot of sort of pumping them up and helping them believe that what they're doing when it finally.
I'll say I get so many conversations prefaced with, Adam, I know you're my lawyer, but can I ask you this question? And it's always something that just goes so far into business issues and interpersonal relationships with their own clients and things like that. And yeah, over time, I think when you first get encountered with those questions, when you're really early on in your career, you're like, what is this? But over time, it just becomes second nature that you almost have to stop yourself sometimes if the clients don't need to hear it. But no, absolutely. That part of it is you can't be a transactional attorney or even a litigator without understanding the businesses you operate in and the industries you operate in and being able to give insight that goes beyond just pure law.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you said something that reminds me. I mean, I do know you're a musician, and music certainly being an area of entertainment. I wanted to ask you because in the fashion sphere, we certainly see a lot of musicians who have become extremely prominent designers. Pharrell,
Yeah.
Ye. The list is pretty impressive. Why do you think that is? Why? What is it about being able to be a performer and musically inclined translates to fashion?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I'd almost want to flip the question on your head and more frame it as, why do we have to categorize and label artists in a specific way? If you have a creative mindset, there's no reason why it necessarily should just be restricted to music or just be restricted to video or just be restricted to designing clothing. If your mind works in a way where you can create something in one area, it stands to reason you'll have the ability potentially in other areas as well. So I think it makes perfect sense that we see that sort of crossover. And, I wouldn't, I would never criticize an artist for trying to jump over into a different space and try something new. On the flip side, kind of going back to what we were talking about before about, big talent, you do also have talent who are just surrounded by yes people who will just be like, ah, you could do that, you can do that. So sometimes some of these things crash and burn. I can tell you, I've certainly worked on many collabs that haven't gotten much of anywhere, despite being very exciting to start. So it's, but just going back to my original sentiment, I guess the answer is like, why not? Like it makes total sense to me. It's like if you're a really good business person in one specific industry, you take the principles there and you move it to a different industry. Nobody questions that for the most part. You just have to figure out the specifics there in the context. But aside from that, you're applying principles, right? And you're using your brain in a way that probably isn't all that different.
Well, so let me change to you. You mentioned you're in your office, which is
Yeah.
so home. That is the norm for a lot of people, a lot of lawyers, whether it's a few days a week or all week. Um, Professional dress and presenting as a lawyer. How has that changed for you? I guess I'll say post COVID,
Sure.
recognizing that entertainment lawyers often present different than, say, big law M&A lawyers. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, you want to project competence, you want to project capability, and hopefully a dash of some elegance. And so, what has that been for you, and has it changed?
Yeah. So even pre-COVID, back in the day when I was working at the mid-sized firm, I was wearing suits almost every single day, partially because I was going to court. But even on the days that I wasn't going to court, and I will say, by the way, just kind of a side note, practicing in Canada when I did go to court, you would appreciate this. I had to wear these gigantic robes that I kept in a velvet bag. Um,
I
but
love a
that's
good
beside the
robe.
point. Yeah. Oh, it's beautiful with these little tab ties. But anywho, even on the off days, I'd be wearing full suits. And I remember there was a day in the office where I didn't really have much of a sense of style back then. I was just wearing whatever. This was the early 2010s, so all my suits back then had the super tight legs as they did.
Yeah.
But I remember one day wearing a pair of two-tone derby shoes, and one of my principals just going like, What are those?" And I'm just like, "Hey man, they're cool. That's what they are."
Yeah.
But anyways, I started my practice, 4 years after that, and I felt the need to wear suits for a little bit of time. And part of it because I was only had just turned 30. I was like, I'm too young. But part of it was a confidence piece. And I will say the through line over the certainly last 8 years is I've become more casual in my dress, knowing that as long as I'm able to look presentable and convey the confidence needed to my clients and to opposing parties, I'm going to be fine. COVID didn't change much of that altogether. My uniform, I will say, is some sort of overshirt and a t-shirt and jeans and boots. That has kind of been my thing on a personal level, but also since maybe 2017, 18 on a professional level for a long time. I wear suits maybe once every 3 months, and that's only for events. I did have a client who was very used to their M&A lawyers ask me on a Zoom call, "Why aren't you wearing a suit?" And I told him because my hourly rate is not suit rates, but I can happily change that and wear a suit on our next call. I think over time, you want to look slightly above casual in our industry. I will say my outfit resembles a lot of what producers tend to wear in the film industry, where they're just wearing like an open overshirt. So it fits, but it changes day to day. And I will say, having worked in the content creator space and just going on Instagram all the time, my fashion tastes have refined over time. My wife constantly says how fancy I am, despite the fact that I'm wearing the same things I've been wearing for the last 2 decades, but maybe the material's gone a little nicer, or you might recognize the label a little bit more so, kind of stuff like that.
It's quiet luxury. It's quiet.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, you brought up something that has hit me early in my career, and even at the ripe old age of 55, I think I still, sometimes do appear younger than I am. And there is an undoubted ageism in the profession, whether it's warranted or not. I mean, I certainly think that a lawyer gets better over time in the
Sure.
practice area that's kind of primary to them if that area doesn't change much. But I think that can be flipped on its head when you are working in a dynamic industry where the law is evolving rapidly, or there isn't yet really accepted law. And I imagine, particularly in the influencer space, that is the case. And you know, so your casual nature, does it also inform that? Meaning, you don't want to be the guy in the suit. You want to be the approachable lawyer who looks good and looks presentable, but ultimately is signaling, I get what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it would be unnecessarily intimidating if I wore a suit and tie to meetings. Um, and a lot of it's. I was mentioning this to my associate the other day. I think I'm finally getting to the point where I'm actually starting to be older than a chunk of my clients in a percentage that didn't exist before. Although I do have a lot of clients like in their 20s and early 30s, so I'm definitely older then. But I'm finally getting to that age where I am getting a little older. I'm not quite 40 yet, but I'll be hitting it next year. And as I get clients who are younger and younger, yeah, I don't want to appear too stuffy or intimidating. And the first thing they see is what you're wearing, right? So that's absolutely part of it. I'm going to be going to a creator focused event in the city this Saturday. And I already know I'm just going to be probably wearing like nice pair of New Balance with jeans, and just something like this on
Well,
top because I
talk
don't I don't want to be too stuffy.
Yeah, talk to me about your style inspirations. I mean, do you have avatars that for you it's like, I want to look like that guy? Whether it's, I mean, it sounds like there is very little in a dividing line between your personal presentation and your professional presentation. But so, who are your style avatars?
Yeah, there's a lot of creators online that have actually informed what I'm wearing today. And on top of that, I live in Brooklyn. I have a kid. I very much embrace the Brooklyn dad aesthetic, which is its own thing. Um, but can't remember their names offhand, but it's really that's what's been informing me. Although it's really interesting to see these days a lot of the male fashion influencers who are into sort of a lot of Americana and workwear, which I'm a big fan of. They are getting inspiration from a lot of the famous celebrities from the 50s and early 60s.
Right.
So you've got your denim and your work shirts and your pleated pants and your boots, and
You're thinking
that's
Paul Newman and James Dean.
Paul Newman is the number one example that I keep coming back to, and I'm just like, yeah, that's perfect for me. I love that. It fits the difference between my work appearance and my personal appearance is I've kind of embraced the wide leg pants in my personal life, but I realize as a lawyer that's maybe a little bit too much sometimes. That's really the only distinction. I won't wear my Carhartt whip camouflage wide leg jeans to a meeting, but I'll certainly wear them on the weekend if I'm going to a client event.
Got you, got you. Well, no, I think Brooklyn Dad is a suitable designation. I think people know what that means. How about brands? Are there any, Mr. Quiet Luxury here? If you care to share, what are some of your favorite menswear brands?
I was in Paris a few weeks ago, and Maison Standard is a local Paris brand that focuses on unisex, basically workwear, French style workwear clothes. I'm obsessed with their stuff now. I actually show up in Paris. I'm like, oh, everyone kind of dresses like what I'm trying to dress like. That's a big brand. I'm a big boots guy. I've got a whole bunch of pairs of Church's boots, which is a British brand that I am really obsessed with. And I really just like how there's all these sort of like mid-level menswear brands coming out these days that focus a lot more on texture than I think we as a culture used to care about. So that the Buck Masons and the Todd Snyders and that stuff, they're kind of big boxy now, but the stuff's great.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned texture. That to me is kind of level two of mixing it up, right? A
Yeah.
lot of people only think color, but texture is just as relevant. And if you have everything one texture, that to me kind of is a little off.
Figuring out silhouettes has been like a big education. Silhouettes and the rule of the one third, two third rule where you're splitting your body up, which also comes from photography, I think is really fascinating. And going like, oh, there are guiding principles here that I can follow just like a lawyer. And like once you kind of key into that, you're like, oh yeah, if I just kind of stick to these things every time, I don't have to overthink it and I'm gonna look fine.
Yeah. Well, how about, so you were just in Paris. Is Paris a city that inspires you in terms of personal style and creativity? And are there others?
Personal style, like I said, yeah, I found that a lot of folks were dressed just like me, and the only difference was they spoke French. They even had the like little beard and hair thing going on. That was my first time there, so I loved it. But in terms of kind of cities that inspire me, New York City at the end of the day is like has become my one true love. I've been here for almost a decade now and could not imagine living anywhere else, The other big city for creatives in the entertainment space is LA, and I do like it, but every time I come back here, I go like, yeah, this is the city for me. Anytime you visit a major metropolitan across the world, it's really interesting to see all the similarities. The differences are sort of what you leave with, but it's the similarities that when you're there, you just go like, this is funky, and it's funky because it attracts all the artists. I was in Mexico City, and there's so many parallels between Paris and New York and Mexico City. Um, it attracts so many people there. From the rest of the country, it's kind of like a filter in with all that stuff, which is amazing to see. So you end up having these amazing interactions because you just the chances of bumping into somebody and talking to someone who's in a space that you love are so much greater than if you're in a smaller place. But the other thing too that's kind of interesting, and I don't know if it's a negative thing or it's something to lament, is how the internet has sort of flattened culture in many ways across the globe. Um, is my work in social media partially to blame? Sure, but I think it's really fascinating that you can then also have shared language of culture in these different places that you go to, because you are going there, and they do understand that really cool 1950s menswear brand from America that somehow made its way over to Paris or Tokyo, right? And you're like, oh, I've got these shared interests with these people that wouldn't exist if it wasn't for this really getting out there on the internet. So I love that about it too. I love the differences, but I also really appreciate the similarities whenever you're going to these spots.
Well, I'll give you a question that I ask virtually every guest. For you, what is the difference between fashion and style?
Ooh. I, if you're going on the personal level, I would say style is the decision you have made that's going to inform what your wardrobe looks like and how you're dressing on a day to day. It's the thing you can maybe label if you have to label something and you say, I dress like this. It's also sort of the defining feature of what you present visually to people when you're out in the world. Fashion is fashion is more all encompassing in my opinion. And this is not something I've ever really thought about in great depth, but fashion is the goal. Fashion is probably the aspiration. Fashion is also the catch-all for everything that is covered by style and clothing, and goes beyond that to your hair and your face and how you even just compose yourself. And then it ties back to art definitively. And I think that's really the biggest piece, coming back to what we were talking about earlier. Fashion is art. It is the personification of art in clothing, or clothing in art, whichever way you want to frame it. So that's the distinction to me.
Unfortunately, a lot of the intellectual property law doesn't agree with that notion, as you well know.
Yes.
But we could talk about that at a later date. Adam, our time is up. Thank you so much for being on, and listeners, thank you for tuning in. See you next time.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. Take care.
Bye now.
You've been listening to The Laws of Style with Douglas Hand. For more information, go to our website at www.hballp.com. And you can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Hand of the Law. Thank you for tuning in, and stay stylish.